Good morning. This is Professor David Weiss from New Jersey City University speaking on our continuation of our podcast programming now from all over the world, providing different perspectives under the guise of our Connecting Bridges and Borders Through Business program, which is part of our IDR flagship under the New Jersey City University. IDR stands for the Institute for Dispute Resolution. And our Connecting Bridges and Borders program connects people on global business and global affairs around the world. Today's discussion is with Laura Skillen from Brussels, who is very focused in her concentration. She is about to receive her PhD in a field of study that deals with emotions, but ties itself to economics, political impact, cultural impact, societal impact, even individual community impacts. And she's going to provide us with some insight, both from the perspective of what's happening in the EU, as well as her specialization that she's been focusing on for some time now with the BRICS exit process, as well as the US sort of perspective coming from Laura's academic discipline, as well as the work that she has done. I'd also like to point out she's the executive director for IMI, a very prestigious organization worldwide. It's called the International Mediation Institute, which I'm proud to say the IDR has been a partner of for many, many years. And it deals with certifying mediators, training them, bringing awareness to mediation around the world, tying it to business, and was a major contributor as an observer to now what is called the Singapore Convention on Mediation for enforcing cross-border mediation settlement agreements. This is a treaty, in fact, that the United States has now entered into as well with a number of countries around the world. And over time, it will be a very important tool for businesses to be able to use when conflicts arise in their business activities. Laura, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here.
So Laura, you have a very fascinating history. You're not originally from Brussels, I know that. Why don't you share a little bit about your story for a minute of where you came from and how you got there?
That is a very long story, but I'll try and keep it brief. So I am originally Australian. I'm from Tasmania in Australia. I like to think it's the home of the super convicts, right? But I left quite a long time ago, and in the intervening time, I've had the privilege of working in multiple countries, including the UK, including Russia, and I've been based here in Brussels for about 5 years now, predominantly with my research, but also doing a bit of work as well.
Wow, so it really gives you a unique perspective from coming from one part of the world we'll refer to as the down underworld, and then coming into Russia, and then really being now at the heartbeat and epicenter of what goes on in in the EU. I mean, you are at the heartbeat of everything that's happening. So can you give us a little bit of understanding about what you've been studying and what you do in your profession in order for the audience to get a little bit of appetizer before we get into a little bit more of the substance of the discussion today?
Sure thing. So I'll start with work first. So as David said, I'm the Executive Director of the International Mediation Institute, which is the international independent standard-setting body for mediation worldwide. So we really try to improve standards in mediation, as well as convene stakeholders and really spread the good word essentially about mediation and what it can do for people and businesses and also societal conflicts. So building bridges and taking down borders, as you might say. For my research, on the surface of things, it looks very different. So my research is really into blame in politics and these political discourses and how what we say about things define what they are. So, and because of that, I look a lot at emotions and polarization. I look at Brexit and sort of what we see happening there in terms of not just, dislike of the EU or what have you, but also that polarization between people who wanted to leave and people who wanted to remain. And I also look a little bit at the context of that in US politics and polarization there.
Well, that's interesting. And maybe we should start diving in first on that element, but that was, I guess, maybe framed differently post-pandemic of COVID-19. But certainly as you're speaking, I'm thinking of a number of other now nation states within the EU framework alone. And certainly there's a comparison that we'll talk about later on in this interview on the US perspective of these emotions and its impact, if you will, on larger scope issues, as I said before in my beginning comments about policy, politics, and how we move forward. So can you give us a little bit of understanding of the work you were doing and what your findings and what you discovered from the BRICS exit process pre-pandemic, and then maybe move us forward a little bit on where that perception is through these emotions in the current state of affairs?
Absolutely. So in looking at Brexit, it's been quite a long process of research, as you can imagine. So looking firstly at what the actual different campaigns were saying, the pro-Leave campaigns, the pro-Remain campaigns, and what kind of devices they were using to convince people, right? And so in the Leave campaign, perhaps unsurprisingly, you can see them blaming the EU for a lot of different things. And so you start to wonder, it's like, well, how does this affect people, and how does it affect people differently? Who does it convince and why? And so to that end, I actually started running a bit of an online experiment. And so in this, I recruited people from all over the UK, and they had to read a short story, basically, right? And in the story varied. So some people would read it so that the EU was at fault for this particular situation. Other people would read it as the UK were at fault. Some people would read it as they themselves were at fault for having done this. And then the other people had no blame at all. And I started to look at actually what the emotions were as an outcome, and therefore what people wanted to do about it. And so what I found, and this certainly bore out when I was later doing interviews and focus groups with Brexiteers, is that when people were reading these quite negative things or things full of blame, they tended to feel, perhaps unsurprisingly, quite annoyed. Okay, but it wasn't just annoyance, it's probably worth saying. There was also a lot of sympathy. And I'll give you the example of the financial crisis, right? And so there was this perception amongst Brexiteers, and I think it's not an uncommon perception, that the EU in some way misbehaved or did the wrong thing during the financial crisis. And so you heard a lot of stories about, Italian austerity, Spanish austerity, Greek austerity, and how people weren't happy with this. And so some people who were sort of read these vignettes and talking about this would get very annoyed, and or potentially, if they were really, really quite into it, get quite angry about it, right? Or sometimes even disgusted. And then other people said that they felt really sorry for the Greeks and Spaniards and the Italians. And these were different groups of people, right? So some were angry or some were annoyed, and some people were sympathetic. But both of these emotions actually really changed how they saw the EU. Some people felt so sorry for the Greeks and Spaniards, they said, well, we can never be friends with the EU, so we have to leave. And others were so angry at the EU for the sort of injustice of what they were doing to other countries, they went, all right, well, that's a reason. And so I think it's really interesting, actually, even thinking about this in the US context as well, where we hear these stories about, well, certain parts of the country are angry for one reason or another in politics. But that's a very easy trap, I think, to fall into. I think it's quite perhaps under-nuanced, because there's a lot of empathy and a lot of sympathy underlying that as well. And I think that that's the basis for good conversation. Back to mediation.
It absolutely is. And it's interesting as you're speaking, and it's part of, I think, a wider scope discussion that we could sort of maybe touch upon very briefly, but it could be its own podcast, which is when these emotions are touched upon. I'm assuming through your findings, some of this is intrinsic within its own culture or nation state, like at the time, the United Kingdom and specifically Britain. But also the existential factors through technology. Like, for example, in the United States, in the last presidential election, there is certainly, as you're aware, and most of the world is aware, the United States has this defragmentation perception. And I'm not suggesting that it's, taking a position on it, but it certainly exists, that there were issues with technology through, for example, Facebook and Cambridge Analytics, that really focused their attention in very, very precise ways around the United States, in certain areas of the United States for voting purposes, to touch on those people's emotions. Did you find that to be something in your own work with the BRICS exit process that amplified that?
Yes, unequivocally, definitely yes.
Interesting.
So yeah, so this is something I've looked at specifically because I mean, it's quite interesting that you bring this up because it was essentially the same organization doing the same thing in the US and in the UK, all right? And it's very well established even how they did that. And so part of what I'm trying to do with my research is not so much, you know, try and develop new privacy policies or legislation or, you know, surrounding social networks or what have you, but look at actual ways to bolster people's resilience against this kind of manipulation, because I don't think it's going anywhere. So, but yeah, it's very pertinent, I would say.
And if we sort of look at that, and we now take your work and concentration pre-pandemic on the BRICS exit process, if you look for the moment at what is happening in the EU, maybe the first question I want to ask you is, what is happening in the EU based on these emotions? When we look at, for example, what we're at least seeing, because I'm not physically there, but what we're hearing on the news and through colleagues in Italy, they're burning the EU flag. We have other regimes within the EU that are taking, we'll say, different positions on how their elected governments should operate for the moment. And it seems to be a hodgepodge of different things happening. And I guess it's a two-part question, and I'll give you the latitude of how you want to answer it. And that is, one, from your study and your explanation of the BRICS exit case study, how do you see the current situation impacting these emotions, the ones that are both intrinsic and then the ones that are potentially who wind up becoming existential through a same paradigm that you validated in my question that I had, which was this Cambridge Analytics sort of model where they amplify what is already happening on the ground to some degree. I'm not suggesting that they're doing it for any reason. That there are certain agendas within every nation state. People have agendas, but you know, is it a concern? And at a larger scope level, could it jeopardize the entire EU system and the project itself, the efficacy of what the spirit of the EU project is? So I'll let you sort of answer this the way that perhaps you'd like to.
I like that you said two-part question. It became like a five-part question, but I'm ready. I'll take it on. So just thinking about this Italian flag burning. And so, yeah, you're right. There have been videos going around of Italians burning the EU flag. And it's quite interesting because you see this and you sort of see, you know, social media commentary and reaction to it. And it does seem a little forced. So I think that there's definitely some sort of agenda going on there for sure. But more importantly, I think what I find quite bizarre about this situation in a way is that the people who are burning the EU flag are people who supported, you know, quite right-wing, like very populist, very Eurosceptic parties, okay? And so on the one hand, they voted for parties who would not then endorse moves to be taken by the EU, and now they're complaining the EU isn't doing enough. So they're simultaneously complaining, be less EU and be more. And so it's quite it's not possible to be both of these things, right? And so I think that honestly it comes back to a misunderstanding of the democratic process in the EU. I was like, well, if you want the EU to be your savior for every possible situation, then vote in people who will do that for you. But I mean, sort of on that note though, you also see now that there's a call for like regional administration of the whole region where this is taking place, right? Because they said, well, like action isn't being taken by these people that they did choose, you know, the Lega Nord, the 5-Star movement. And so now they're like, all right, well, let's bring in other people to actually administer the region because this government is clearly underperforming, right? And so I think that a major problem, I think, is that when we look at these situations, you know, when we look at this flag burning, and particularly in the current context when none of us can go outside, right, that all of that information is through a screen. I think that if we start to talk about it as this is an existential danger without questioning that really underlying narrative, then really we're actually kind of creating that danger. So when we have these like catastrophizing thoughts, right, we say, oh, everything's going to fall apart, the EU is over, whatever, like that makes it more real and that sort of gains some credence. But I mean, honestly, as I see it, it's not such a problem. And I think as well, so I mean, I sort of mentioned this idea of, well, they're asking for more EU, right? They're asking for an EU response. But as it is, of course, everything that's done by the EU has to be agreed by all member states, right? And, legislated, regulated, what have you. And at the moment, the EU has almost no competence for medical work, right? So they don't have to do it because it's never been agreed to. This is something that lies with national governments. There are mechanisms to try and sort of bolster the EU. They've got a medical, what is it, like the CDC, right? I know the American one, not the EU one. They've got the EU equivalent to start doing research and what have you.
Right.
And at the same time, of course, they are taking economic measures, which is the area in which the EU does have competence. I mean, some people have said that they don't go quite far enough, but you know, all member states have to agree. And they are sort of, you know, leveraging the stability mechanism to try and get people so they can sort of survive post-corona in terms of their unemployment and what have you. I mean, I think altogether, it's nearly the same amount as in the US as far as aid goes. You know, it's that nearly $1 trillion mark. So a lot is actually being done in the areas in which the EU can do things. But perhaps communication does need to be improved, as well as knowledge of how the EU works.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up several points that, as I'm hearing you speak, reminds me of the controversy going on here in the United States between what the responsibilities are of the federal government versus what the responsibilities are of the state governments in terms of both addressing the localized public health issues and what the role of the federal government is in that process. And it's a very, 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 we'll say, healthy discourse between the different, even media channels who represent different stakeholders' interests, especially as now we're in the middle of a presidential election coming up in November. And I'd like to explore that with you in a moment. I like to sort of, before we do that though, you brought up another point that I thought was interesting, which is this regional sort of concept. And you know, something like, for example, there's the V4, which is a regional area of Europe. And for those that are not necessarily familiar with that, the V4 is something that encompasses several countries: Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. And I assume that there are other regional compacts, we'll call it, going on around the EU. Do you see, though, a concern that through this process and the idea of these emotions playing and having an impact ultimately on either political, economic issues, to become something that could lead to more of a dislocation of Brussels' purpose and these regional compacts becoming the power structure, even though there may still be an EU shell, we'll say?
I mean, it's a good question. And certainly there has been a fairly long-standing discussion about this idea of a two-speed Europe, right? So predominantly sort of Western European states integrating more quickly, and then the Eastern European states integrating more slowly. But we haven't seen that yet. I mean, I think one thing that is not necessarily known about the EU is that even if you're in it, you can still cooperate with states across your border. And so, you know, we talk about the Benelux group, so Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and they have particular initiatives. But I mean, the reason that the so-called V4, the Visegrad group, gets so much attention is because they are quite skeptical or Eurosceptical, particularly driven by Hungary, you'd have to say, and particularly during the era of, you know, the so-called migrant crisis. There's a lot of pushback there. And so, I mean, these groups, they are politicized, but it doesn't mean that they're necessarily always going to stick around or be in the same configuration. In the past couple of days, we've heard about the Fiscal Four, which is Germany, I think Netherlands, Denmark, and I guess the fourth member as well. And they've been sort of pushing back against this idea of corona bonds, so having shared mutual debt across the continent. And so for the meantime, Fiscal Four means something, but will it mean something in 6 months, in 12 months? Maybe not. But perhaps your question, though, it does get to the heart of what will actually happen with the EU project going forward. Because I mean, I do think it will weather this crisis. I think it'll be interesting to see, though, whether it leads to more Europe or less, and whether it does, in fact, really engage this two-speed Europe. And then it's like, well, if you start to think about, well, will this be done in separate blocks? It's not necessarily clear what those blocks would be or in which ways they would integrate. And so perhaps for that reason, I suspect that we will continue to see slow but iterative movements and regulations and what have you, which will always inevitably be based on the lower common denominator. So what all the member states agree to.
And so, shifting sort of this conversation a little bit for just a comparative analysis, how do you see that the U.S. perspective? Again, we're inside the looking glass. You're on the outside of the looking glass. Sort of the same thing for us. We're on the outside looking in at seeing what's happening with the EU. And certainly for our audience, it's the EU is an extremely important partner to the United States. It perhaps may become even more important partner to the United States post-pandemic. It's obviously has one of the largest economies collectively in the world, and
the largest.
Yeah, the largest. And one of the I think issues here is both, from a U.S. level, if we look at it, is both national security, which has always been part of the structures, primarily through the NATO alliance. It has to do with the economic trade that we have between us and the EU, and certainly what opportunities and the freedom and flexibility that are more like kind in terms of the democratic principles and values that the EU stands for, which the United States has also. So there's a number of different characteristics there. What is your perception of what's happening looking from your inner glass outwards to the United States as you apply these principles of behavior, both on the individual level as well as in how it impacts as you're seeing it play out here in the United States, given the pandemic, and what happens next?
Well, I think there's a lot in that question, to be honest. Firstly, I'd sort of like to just quickly though address the direct comparison, because I just want to be really, really clear that while the EU does have these elements of shared competence, it really is still very much governments working together with an additional voice from the citizens, right? It's not a full federation like the US. So things will always be different for that reason, because again, the EU doesn't have specific health competence, whereas of course that's different in the US, right? But with that said, from the outside, there seem to be some very bizarre things going on in the US. Taking the example of equipment, whether it's ventilators or masks and what have you, the EU arranged to come together and bulk buy these things and distribute them to the countries that needed them, as well as there being, inter-member state cooperation. So there's people being shipped around to be taken care of, right? And then you hear about the US stockpiles, A, not being sufficient, and B, not being distributed, and you're going, way to have a #1 democracy in the world, guys. Like, what's going on here? And so I guess it's an interesting moment in time for the US, where you're actually seeing less cooperation between, the federal government, which in your example, would be the EU, and the constituent states. So it's just very strange to sort of see that at this point in time. And I guess ideally you would see more interstate cooperation, but also more federal to state level cooperation, because you're part of one union.
Yeah, and I guess my follow-up question would be is how could that dislocation within the United States, because obviously it's both based on behavior, emotions, different ideology, different generations. There's a whole hodgepodge of rationale of even before the pandemic where the United States sat vis-a-vis geopolitically its role, even its doctrinal policy role, right, with the EU. It's dramatically different from the Obama administration into the Trump administration. So, again, another very complex issue, but if we just refine it to a more simple question is, if the status of the situation continues with this sort of dislocation of friction in the United States, even though, we come out of the pandemic, we start operating at some level again. How does that impact the ability for the EU to also function? Because in a globalized world, there needs to be some both interdependence and internal dependence.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it seems like there are a lot of issues to unpack there. I mean, I think one of them, though, which is sort of getting towards is this perception, how the US is seen as a trading partner, how they'll be seen moving forward, right? And I mean, of course, the opinion of the US has degraded. It's gone down a lot. They're seen as an unreliable business partner. Certainly at sort of that international level, right? It's like, well, who knows what's going to happen in terms of policy? You can't predict it. And of course, if you can't predict something, you can't rely on something, you can't plan with that partner. So you do need obviously like a more sort of stable base there. But then sort of looking at individuals, it's really interesting because sort of really getting down to that level, we actually see, just Joe blogs on the street, right? Or Joanna blogs. Let's be more inclusive here. Walking down the street, and we are seeing actually international alliances on that sort of more cultural level, right? Which is based more on sort of like different ideologies, facilitated, of course, by the internet and technologies. And so perhaps it's not just a matter of US-EU relations going forward, but it's also a larger question of like, well, how do we resolve ideological polarization that we're seeing in these societies? Like whether it's sort of, related to Euroscepticism or, relations between Democrats and Republicans in the US, we're seeing like fairly similar trends, right? And I mean, they all, of course, pertain a bit to the stories we tell about ourselves and each other and who we are and like who's the good guy, who's the bad guy and what have you. But I mean, if there's one thing that, I've really found when speaking with Brexiteers, so people who wanted to leave the EU and the UK, right, is that what has entrenched them is this perception of them as being racist or stupid or old or whatever it might be, right? Because again, that's the story that we tell. But of course, it's not true. But the moment, I'm speaking to these like highly intelligent people or, far out like left-wing people who wanted to leave the EU. And they said, look, the moment people started saying that I was a racist or that I was old or that I was stupid, that is when I said, you know what, I will never join your side. And so I think a lot of healing will really need to be done actually within our own societies to see that A, we have more in common than we have differently. And, B is mediation 101. It's not you against me, it's us against the problem.
We go back to the old mediation circle again.
Always, yeah.
Always. You bring up something about the common bonds. I mean, one of the historical, of course, challenges, and that was one of the reasons for the Fulbright, Congressman Fulbright, which became the Fulbright experiences, both inbound and outbound to the United States, is the uniqueness of the United States, both historically, how it was created, the country, but also it being separated by this barrier of what's called the Atlantic Ocean. Europe has its own challenge in the sense that it has 1,000-year plus, probably more than that, going back to the Roman Empire, but at least 1,000 years, each country of its own history, which creates its own problematic issue, right? To the reason why it's not a United States of the EU, right? So trying to sort of look at this as more, I think we've sort of explored some of these issues. What would you look at that could create some more common bonds beyond just student exchanges and, again, understand the practicality, at least for now in the United States? We're not, we don't have a gap year concept where we require, or at least maybe it's not even a requirement, but it's just a custom to send mainstream all young American students after high school or abroad, even before they start their university educations. I mean, certainly there's the argument would be, oh, well, anyone who goes to college can have the opportunity to do a semester abroad or summer experience. But you've already kind of been shaped by the time you come to the university level. So how do we sort of come up with maybe one or two or three ideas that has come through your research that could sort of create a little bit more common bonds? Because within the EU, because of the proximity of the fact that you could travel freely, of course, until the pandemic. And hopefully after this is over, that will go back to some, at least that important feature will come back into play. But I mean, this is also an issue for Britain now as well. So they could become very isolated in a sense, almost historically pre-World War II concepts. So where do you see some of these common bonds that we could sort of chew on and think about, both businesses, academics, organizations that are really working hard to try to look at and take the pandemic as an opportunity? We can talk about all the negative things that have come out of the pandemic, but an opportunity that as we restart our economies, as we reshape our lives, this transformative experience we've all had, I think is an opportunity for us to sort of look at new models, new paradigms. And what would be some of those suggestions you would have?
Okay, so solve the US, in other words. I mean, it's quite interesting because, of course, yeah, absolutely. Within Europe, they've got the Erasmus Plus program, so lots of exchanges, but of course, it's also quite easy with freedom of movement to do gap years. But of course, you're talking to an Australian, and I didn't grow up in the EU, so I was also on my own little continent. But in Australia, it's pretty normal to do a gap year. And so certainly when you're in Europe, it's normal to encounter Australians who are traveling for maybe, 2 years at a time, because that's an experience. But I think that as far as how that will become sort of normal in terms of building those bonds, in terms of having that exposure, you've got a few structural problems in the US. I mean, of course, the cost of university or college. So I mean, like, how can you possibly save up for that and also travel the world, right? It's a far-flung dream. But also, secondly, is sort of potentially a problem in terms of how people are employed. Because the thing is, people who travel and people who do have these experiences, they are good employees, right? They're flexible. They can deal with being stranded at 4 in the morning with no bus in the middle of nowhere, and they can think on their feet. But, people look at this on a CV and go, oh, that's a resume gap. That's a problem. And so I think we really actually need to start recruiting as well, and understand this in business, that these are skills that will help to make our businesses more resilient, as well as our culture and society, and to build those bonds. And of course, as well, when people are traveling, they are making bonds which you can leverage in the workplace as well. This is very corporate of me thinking in this way, but I think it's to the question you're asking.
No, it absolutely is to the question I'm asking, and even though I think it's a nice cliffhanger to leave out there, because the discussion on this could go very deep in terms of, even when a lot of the, for example, university students do go to Europe, they're there for it's like a vacation. They're there for a little bit of time, and then they go back. And the culture in the United States has never been one to really create this common bond. It's more of an experience. And then you come back to the culture in which the United States has operated in, both through its higher education systems, its it's elementary and secondary school systems. And perhaps that's the cliffhanger we'll leave, which is, when we look at and explore common bonds in a new economy post-pandemic, maybe we should start thinking about how we can define the scope of what not only education experiences look like, but also some of these economic issues you raised about the cost of education, which would be an impact or a detriment to doing that. And then also from the level of the commercial world, when we're looking at going to get your job, being either frowned upon for a gap year, or moreover, the United States has always been one about, you work, and one day when you retire, then you can enjoy your life. And of course, we all, right. Of course it's wrong. Of course it's wrong. I mean, but that's because of our generation. We see our parents. We saw within the baby boom generation of post-World War II, which are the offspring of our grandparents, of those that were here, that were what we define the United States as the greatest generation because of the war. But the reality is that they defined a society, both on a personal structure as well as what was done economically as a structure, that it's about working, and that defines the capitalist sort of system, which then is part of democracy. And if you're either, as George Bush once said after 9/11, you're either with us or you're against us. So I think those that sort of edged out of the box and sort of did things in a more, we'll say, entrepreneurial or less structured, or what they used to now call the disruptor, right? Which created companies like Facebook and lots of different .com companies, and it's a badge of honor. But that was originally really to try to be a backlash to say, get back in the corner and follow the structure of corporate America as it was designed after post-World War II, which, as you know, was part of the whole entire Marshall Plan, both in Europe and in Japan. So these are really salient points you raise, and it'll be, we'll leave it to the audience to maybe think about and digest as we have, I think, really productive discussions going forward with many people, both on policy, economic models, and really what is important to them, that quality of life. So Laura, I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to engage in this important discussion and understanding how behavior really impacts these high-level macro issues within this micro level discussion today. And once again, Bridges and Borders program will continue its series. Look forward to our next one, which will be happening this week. We thank the audience again for all of its support and how education can play a role in contributing to the greater society, both from a business level as well as a scholarship and policy level. Until the next time, I bid adieu. Take care.